welcome back to another episode of Conversations, the show where we're all about igniting human potential through some of those maybe deeper, more convoluted topics than can be fixed in a 60-minute webinar. So here's where we open the can of worms into some of these deep human. We're talking about human connection today. The deep human principles that keep us connected at work, at home, in life, in all the places. So that we can be our best selves wherever we show up. And I was very excited when I met Richard, I will be honest with you, because both of us have a common passion about connection. And so we're going to be talking about that today from a specific lens of reestablishing social networks. So first of all, we're going to create a definition of what is a social network, because some people might be like, hey, LinkedIn is a social network and Facebook's a social network. And that's not wrong. But for the framework of our conversation today, we're going to go a little bit more human and less technology on our definition of the social network and what happened to some of those social networks during COVID and before that, but I think we became aware of it during COVID, and how we can reestablish some of those social networks so that we can feel more belonging, more connection, more engagement as the humans that we are. And as a note, this is also relevant in your workplace. So if you're looking and exploring, talking about remote work and in-person work, let's pull this back to the definition of the social network, and how that works in your business place. So before we get too far into it, let's welcome our guests in the comments. Manish, welcome to the show. Kim, always good to see you, my friend. And if you are here watching live, get in the comments. One of the things about the conversation show, while it might look like a conversation between Tracy and Richard today, this is a conversation for all of us. And the more that you share your questions, your perspectives, the more holistic we can make the conversation. And Richard and I get to learn as well. And everybody who comes on this show loves to learn and have their perspectives put to the test. So please feel free to do that as part of the show. Let us know you're here. All right, let's learn a little bit more about Richard before we jump into this conversation for today. So Richard, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and why reestablishing social networks is something you're so passionate about?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Tracy, for having me on the show. I'm sure I could talk about connection for hours, but we'll spend some time together today. One way I like to frame or introduce myself is this idea of, or the phrase, healing the hole in my heart. In the sense that I think all of us have had personal challenges and struggles that might end up informing the type of work we're passionate about or the type of causes that we want to champion and address in the world. So that was very much the case for me, where I grew up feeling quite shy and lonely and had all sorts of misconceptions, for example, on, in media, like in books and TV shows and movies, they always portray the main character and then they have their best friend or their squad of best friends. And I thought, that's what I need to have as well. And so when I never had someone I considered my best friend, or they would consider me their best friend, I always felt like I was missing something or something was wrong with me. It was until many years later that I realized, well, first of all, it's not healthy for me to expect one person to fulfill all my social needs. And it's perfectly normal for people to come and go and for me to have different communities of people for my different types of interests. But again, I suffered so long because I had these misconceptions, and we just don't talk about this topic enough, about loneliness and friendships and belonging. And so I'm really passionate about addressing that, both as a self-healing journey, but realizing that this is a common struggle that many people have. So, as you were alluding to earlier, the pandemic, I think, messed all of our lives up to various extents, but especially about disrupting our normal patterns of how we would normally interact with each other face to face in person. And so I know for sure I had a transition period coming out of the pandemic to figure out, like, what do we do now? Because there's people certainly I lost touch with. I did make new connections as well digitally through the pandemic. And how did I want to proceed with this? So yeah, reestablishing social networks is important, not just for your personal well-being, but for all your professional pursuits, or as you mentioned, in the workplace as well. So yeah, I guess that's where I'll start off with.
Okay, so Richard, you touched on this concept of loneliness, and I think that this is something that a lot of people experience, but that a lot of people don't talk about.
Yeah.
And that there is maybe some degree of shame or blame that goes on that, and that, like, this is my fault. It's my fault that I'm
Yes.
lonely. Um, and then there's, I mean, a kind of a vicious cycle. And
Hmm.
how
Hmm.
do we get out of that? So, in because I know you do a lot of workshops with students and things like that too. Is there any tips or advice that you would give us in this, like just starting out with the conversation of loneliness and how we
Yep.
can like accept for ourselves as a first
Yep.
step that we're lonely and we'd like something to be different?
Yeah, I guess where the best place to start off is with a definition, because we do throw around these words like loneliness and connection and social isolation a lot. One definition of loneliness I like is it's the discrepancy between your desired level of connection and your actual level of connections. So, what this definition reveals is actually it's completely subjective in the sense that someone could be physically surrounded by people and have tons of social interaction every day, but still feel lonely because there's something that's missing between what they're desiring. Maybe it's the level of intimacy or being able, like, who can you actually call in the middle of the night if you needed help, stuff like that. So, and it also accounts for the introvert extrovert spectrum too, because you could have few close connections and feel perfectly content and not lonely if there's no discrepancy between what you're desiring and what it's actually like. So, starting off with that definition, because there might be something there where, okay, maybe it's about adjusting your expectations around it, or maybe it is an indicator that you might want to take more action to bridge that gap. So, starting with that, and the other thing I want to highlight too, as you mentioned, is like there's still a lot of stigma and shame surrounding this when I believe it should be normalized. Loneliness is a normal feeling. There's a reason why we experience it, because it's biologically adaptive. If we think about our ancestors, we would not survive without community. And so it's wired into us for loneliness to feel painful, so that it indicates to us like we need to stick together in order to survive and thrive. But part of the challenges with that now is, um, in our modern day lives, we don't technically need each other for survival, because we live in our own homes and we're quite separated, but that's still loneliness feeling or trigger still in our minds. So it's just learning. Part of it's recognizing it's normal. The way I compare it is when you're thirsty, it's your body's way of telling you you need to drink water. And if you're hungry, it's your body's way of telling you to go get food. And loneliness is that same biological indicator. It's like it's telling you maybe you should go connect more. So just having that definition and like biological basis, first of all, but then the question gets to how. Like that's good at all, Richard, but like how do you go about it? I think oh, there's so many places I could start with. One tool I'll offer now, and then you could ask some follow up questions.
Yeah.
I know one barrier for folks is, well, what if you get rejected? Like you have all these different fears or what if scenarios that circulate in your mind that might prevent you from taking action. And one helpful tool I learned from my therapist actually is called a fear ladder. So imagine there's a ladder with like 10 different rungs on it, and each one corresponds to a level of fear. So let's say on a scale of 1 to 10. Because if I tell someone, hey, just start a conversation with a stranger at a coffee shop, that might be like a 9 or 10 on someone's fear ladder, because like there's so many things out of your control. What if it goes wrong? What if it's awkward?
What if that
Like
person's
all these
having a
things.
bad day?
Exactly. Yeah. So because that's a 9 or 10 on someone's fear ladder, that's actually too big of a leap for most people to take action. So instead, what you can ask yourself is, well, what's your 1 out of 10 on your fear ladder? What's something that's slightly outside of your comfort zone, but still feels doable? And then you can practice that behavior enough times until you expand your comfort zone. And then you can go to what's your 2 out of 10 and 3 out of 10. And just to give an example, I've asked someone this question before, like, what's their 1 out of 10 on their fear ladder? And they told me, well, I'm going to reach out to one of my existing friends and ask if we can meet for coffee. Because there's already a rapport there. Like the chance of rejection is quite low because they already know each other, but yet it's still practicing the skill of reaching out and making connections. So yeah, that person can practice that enough, and then they could keep expanding. So the reason I like this framework is it meets people where they're at, and there doesn't need to be any shame because you know your own comfort levels, and you can decide the actions that will help move you forward.
Yeah, I think I really love this. So I've always seen connection as a
Mm-hmm.
skill, right? It's like
Yes. Yep.
something that we practice, that we build, and then you get good at it.
Yep.
And I love the concept of the ladder because it's like I remember when I was in, I don't know, it was grade 2, grade 3, and we had these
Yeah.
spelling ladders, right? And we learned how to spell words by doing a ladder. First you would do A, and then you do P, and or AP, APP,
Yep.
APPL, APPLE, and then you could spell apple,
Right.
right? And I think a
Yep.
lot of times as adults, and maybe even as adolescents, we forget that there's this like learning process to get to a skill, right? Like we started
Yep.
riding our bike and we weren't very good at it. And then we rode our bike a lot and then we got good at riding a bike. And
Yep.
connection is a skill. And so if we're going to practice, we got to practice if we're going to get good at it.
Exactly. I mean, even the word social skills has the word skill did it. So yeah, exactly.
But somehow we forget. we it's very easy somehow for us to see like, okay, if we're building a technical skill, like we're building a skill on how to code, then we practice coding.
Yeah.
But if we
Yeah.
I think sometimes I think these human skills are things that people assume they should just have. I'm like, I'm a human. This is a human skill. So I should just be good at connection. But what's the danger in shooting ourselves in the connection?
Yeah. It's funny when I was taking I'm certified as a coach, and when I was going through my training, our facilitator said like, don't shit on yourself because the should, it has so much emotional charge to it. It's like shame and judgment on yourself. Like, well, I should know these things, but that doesn't feel good. Because basically, yeah, you're blaming or criticizing yourself rather than seeing it from a more neutral perspective. One thing I was sharing with Tracy before we started recording is this idea that, of course, individuals are responsible for their own lives and the actions that they take. But when it comes to an issue like loneliness, I prefer to see it from a lens of public health or from a systemic lens, because I don't think the burden of responsibility solely falls on the individual. One thing I say a lot is I never grew up with a class on how to make friends or how to communicate effectively or how to set healthy boundaries. And I was saying before, that led to some misconceptions on like, well, I feel like I should have a best friend or a group of best friends. And so if this stuff was taught to us, whether in the school setting or from our parents or our upbringing, then we would know these things. But if they weren't taught to us, then how would you know otherwise? And so I don't think that blame really falls on you. Like you feel like you should know these things, but if it wasn't taught to you, it's not really your fault. But also recognizing it can be learned and it can be practiced. And I think with the pandemic, everyone's social skills got a bit rusty because we were not having that regular type of interaction anymore. So to give yourself some grace and self-compassion too. Yeah. So yeah, it's you can learn, you can practice it, and you might fall off your bike, but you can get back on.
Yeah. Well, and this is the thing, right? Like I'm being maybe ridiculous in my example here, but like we don't just assume we should know how to fly an airplane.
Yeah, right? Exactly.
You have to learn how to fly an airplane. And these are, while we have this like natural predisposition to desire connection between each other, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have the skills to create that. And one of the things that you touched on in your intro too, Richard, was this of like, there's not one person doesn't have to meet all your social needs. And I think this is something we put a lot of pressure on our like spousal relationships, right? We're gonna marry this person and they're going to meet all of our needs ever. And you're like, well, that's not really fair. So when we're building out this like network of people who can provide social relationships in different arenas. What do we need to start to pay attention to in ourselves in this discrepancy of the like type of social interactions we're desiring, and how do we go about finding those?
Yeah. I think so much of this starts with recognizing that you can design for connection, which then involves a lot of self-reflection and reflecting like, what is it that I want? Like, what is my intention? Because for some people, it might be expanding your network, so like meeting new people, but maybe for other people, it's deepening your existing relationships. For example, if there's someone you've lost touch with or you don't see that frequently on a base that frequently, maybe it's clear to you that, oh, I want to reach out to this person more or reconnect with this person. So really, there's so many different paths, but it starts with reflecting on, well, what is it that you want? One way that you could map this out, if you imagine a graph, there's two different axes, your x and your y axis. One of the axes can be frequency, and the other axis can be quality. So any of your relationships in your life, you could plot along that graph. And so, for example, you might have a relationship. By quality, by the way, I mean, is it energizing or is it draining? Because just because you have connections in your life doesn't always mean that they're positive. Some of them can be toxic and draining to you. And so you can pick a person in your life and think about, well, okay, is generally speaking, when I interact with this person, does it feel energizing or does it feel draining? And then plotting that. And then in terms of frequency, how frequently or infrequently are you seeing this person? So wherever you plot that point on your graph, and you can do this with several relationships in your life, then you can ask yourself, well, okay, am I happy with where this person is on this graph? And if not, where might I want to adjust it to? For example, there might be someone in your life where when you do get a chance to interact with them, it's very energizing, but you only see each other maybe like 2 or 3 times a year. And you might think like, okay, actually, I really do value this relationship and I want to increase the frequency of it. And you can reach out to that person because I don't feel like it's mechanical. Like, because unless people clearly communicate what is this that you're wanting from this relationship, people can't read each other's minds. And so it's possible to like come to a middle ground of saying like, well, I value this relationship and I'd love to be able to meet more frequently. Are you open to that? And so those are some ways you can go about it. But again, like, starts with your intention, and you can use this graph of frequency and quality to help visualize some of those relationships too, to see, yeah, maybe you want to interact with that person more. Maybe you want to interact with them less if you find that it's draining. So that involves a different conversation around boundary setting. So there's a lot of depth and nuance to it.
Yeah. This is like super. So one of the things I love the definition of energizing versus draining. And one of the things that comes up to me is that almost like, how do we know what we want? Right? Because I know I've had this experience in my life where I thought I should have a better relationship with my sisters, right? Because we're sisters and we should be friends, right? And so I put a lot of effort into doing that, but that effort was draining and it also wasn't reciprocated. And so for a really long time, I was like, oh, there's something wrong with me. Like, why do my sisters not want to be friends with me? And then I started looking at like, okay, well, like, I don't get energy there. I get energy over here. And that doesn't mean they're not my sisters and I'm not going to see them and they're not going to build a relationship with my son and these types of things. But it was better. It was a better shift for me to focus on what did I want? I wanted connection and I couldn't get connection here, but there were other places where I could get connection. And a LinkedIn user is also saying, I have the same experience with my older siblings. So it's not just me. And that's younger siblings from my perspective. I'm the oldest. But I think that was one of the times where maybe the most obvious time where I became aware of, I wanted connection and I thought I should get it from here. But that's actually not, I had created a framework which wasn't actually necessary. I could go and get that connection elsewhere and feel connected. And it actually impacted, like I actually feel more connected with my sisters, even though I'm not actually connecting with them because I have more capacity for connection because I got connection elsewhere. Now I feel like maybe that got convoluted.
Oh no, I get what you're saying.
But like, is that something you see a lot too, Richard, as people who like think they should be more connected or think they should connect more with a specific group of people, but it actually ends up being more draining than energizing?
Yeah. There's, where do I start with this? Because I've gone through my own personal journey too, and I recognize when I was younger, I had quite a lot of personal insecurities, and that influenced the way that I behaved and connected with people, because I felt, or I had this big fear about abandonment in terms of like, I don't want to be abandoned. So whatever types of connections that I do end up making, I sort of cling onto it. I don't want it to slip away. But now recognizing that a lot of my, because I had those personal insecurities, a lot of my connecting really felt from a sense of desperation of like, I need these connections to feel good enough about myself. I need that sense of validation and acceptance. And that did lead to some dynamics where then, for example, you people please, right? Because I would want to avoid any type of conflict or any sign of discomfort and try to mend it and fix it and, compromise my own boundaries to make sure that other people are feeling good and no one is unhappy around me. And so it took, I mean, a lot of self-work, I think, and we're all like on different parts of this journey, but a really pivotal shift for me was connecting with myself first. Because when I have a secure relationship to myself, then I'm no longer as concerned or worried about what are other people thinking about me, because I feel good about who I am. And that's when too I can realize that it's actually okay if not everyone likes me. It's actually okay that I don't get along with everyone. Because in the past, that was not what I believed. I'm like, I need to get along with everyone. I need everyone to like me. But once I was more secure in myself, then it allows you to sort that through, as you're saying, where perhaps there's these societal or familial expectations that you should be getting along well with your sisters or your siblings. But if you really reflect on it and it's like it's not meeting your needs, it's okay to set boundaries around that and choose the type of people in your life that you do want to invest your time and energy into. Because yes, there's your given biological family, but you can choose your family too, right? Or even like the saying like home is where the heart is. So you can choose your community and cultivate the type of people that you want to have in your life. But yeah, this point about connecting with yourself, I think, is a really important part of the conversation, because yes, of course, there's all sorts of strategies about networking and like connecting with people externally, but also thinking about what's your relationship to yourself. Are you being a good friend to yourself, or are you being really self-critical and all these shoulds and worries that might still be circulating?
Yeah. And I feel like that is also a skill, to start to hear those shoulds and how you might be self-judging yourself, right? Like, yes, I should. And Kim is just also saying that she's just learning this as well, connection to self. So thanks for reiterating that. I think we probably can never reiterate that too much, because when it comes to like, I have this conversation with another friend of mine quite often about belonging. Is this kind of chicken and egg? What comes first, self-belonging or group belonging? And I don't know that it's a chicken and egg scenario, because I think both of those things exist on a spectrum in different areas at different times. And you can have group belonging that allows you to find more self-belonging, and you can have self-belonging that allows you to find the right group of people. But in either of those scenarios, it's a learning activity. And this is something I say to people all of the time, is that there's a place where everyone belongs, but not everyone belongs in every place.
Mm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
it's, if you're in a place or a social network or a workplace or a community where you're like, you constantly think you have to adjust yourself to fit
Yep.
in or to match the
Mm-hmm.
profile,
Mm-hmm.
that's not necessarily a downfall or something that you are missing. That
Yep.
means that there's not 100% alignment in this space.
Yep.
And I mean, again, I talk about this all the time from a like marketing and sales perspective, is that like
Yep.
we go out to the market and we're like, we'll make this totally generic and everyone will resonate with it, except then
Right. Yep.
nobody resonates with it.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Mm-hmm.
your people,
Yep.
and they're not all people. And nor could most, I mean, maybe big businesses like Coca-Cola and stuff wish that they had 8 billion customers, but I don't think most companies wish for that, actually. I
Yep.
think they want
Yep.
a like solid customer base that's aligned with them, that wants to go on the same mission, believe the same
Yep.
things, value the same values. And so when it comes to social networks, Richard, what are some of the other limiting I don't want to say limiting beliefs because I don't think it's actually related to beliefs, but what are some of the roadblocks, maybe we'll say, to finding those like social networks that are a match for you?
Yeah. Oh, again, there's there's so many
I know this is what we
avenues
do
I could take
here.
with
We
it.
open
No.
cans of worms. So as you
Yeah.
all can tell, we are talking about a very small percentage of this conversation today. Take it wherever
Um.
you want to go, Richard.
Yeah. One thing that I mean, I was interested in before, but I feel like my passion for it's really increased over time is this idea of psychological safety. Because you touched on it too. Like, are you in an environment where you feel safe to be yourself? Because if not, then that might be an indicator to you that, again, it's not your fault. It's the environment that you're in, whether that's in a workplace context or in your personal and family life. But one question around psychological safety is like, is it expensive or costly to be yourself, whether that's from an emotional level or financial level or other types of barriers? Because it can feel incredibly draining and stifling to sort of just like dread, like, oh, I'm going back into this workplace another day and I can't really speak my mind and I need to just like grin and bear it and keep my head down and just do my work, which is not an environment where you're seen as a holistic human and really flourishing and being able to, utilize your full potential. And so it's challenging because sometimes you do need to be, you need to work to make a living, of course, but I'm a big advocate for having being able to be in environments where you can be yourself and be authentic and supported. And sometimes it's making those hard decisions of like, maybe this is not the right place for me and I need to find somewhere else. Because I've been in a toxic workplace and environment before. And looking back on it now, I realize that there's some self gaslighting too, that you convince yourself like this is okay, right? Like this is normal, right? But when you're in an environment where you are truly surrounded by a community that supports you and inspires you and wants the best for you, it just feels so different. And because of that stark contrast, I'm like, wow, why did I ever tolerate, those types of comments or abuse or so on? So one other way I could distinguish this too is I once in a Q&A I was asked about the peer pressure and like what do you do about that? But my response back was, well, what's the difference between peer pressure and peer support? Because in both cases it's social groups or the people around you that are influencing you. When it comes to peer pressure, I think that's when you and the people around you are misaligned. And so then there's this pressure that you need to conform or change yourself in order to fit in with the rest of the people there. But when it comes to peer support, I think that's when there is alignment. And in that case, I want to be influenced by others because, if I can see someone that's doing something inspirational or pursuing their dreams, what I might think is if they can do it, I can do it too. And so there's a sense of positive momentum or being pushed forward because of those community of people around you. So having, again, like self-reflection and then looking externally too, is like, is there alignment between the things you care about, your core values? Is there alignment with those people around you? And if not, again, that might indicate that you need to reduce your interaction with some people, and you might need to cultivate new connections with people that are further aligned. And it's normal because people change and grow. So some people, your relationship might naturally fade away, because you're in different parts of or chapters of your life now, and that might mean it's a new opportunity to meet different types of people. So connection's going to be with you your whole life, because naturally we go through all these transitions, whether it's getting married or having kids or retiring, or some people go through divorce and breakups. So there's lots of these transitions in our life, and that also involves transitioning or reestablishing our social networks
Yeah.
in each of those stages.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle too, right? Is that it's kind of the natural evolution of relationships that we will have to go through these different moments of reestablishing our social networks. So like I moved to a different town last summer and I didn't know anyone, and I had to reestablish my local network. And I mean, I think in that scenario, again, our brains logically know that we're probably going to have to, like, our friends aren't moving with us. So I'm probably going to have to make new friends. Or when I was young, we actually moved around a lot. We went to lots of different schools, and you would know that you have to make new friends. It doesn't mean that you necessarily lose all of your old friends, but my new friends are not here. So I need to make new friends. And it's, again, it's like really interesting to think about how there's these seems to be these natural times in our life where this happened and we accept that that should happen, but also there's some times where that same thing is happening, it's equally natural, but we didn't prepare for it. Right? So the pandemic is an example of that, right? All of us went online and we weren't prepared for that, and so we didn't have this prep thoughts that, like, okay, I'm going to have to reestablish my social network as part of this, right? It was outside of the normal realm of where I think I might have to do that. And so in those moments where we get kind of thrown into the need of reestablishing a social network, where it's a little bit like, yeah, I guess we just get thrown into it. Are there any things we can do, any practices that can help us like normalize that so that we can kind of get it back into our expectation of what, okay, I'm doing is reestablishing a social network.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up. There's a great book I'll mention. It's called "Life Is in the Transitions" by Bruce Feiler, and the whole book talks about how our concept that life is supposed to be linear is not true, because life is very messy and not straightforward. But we do have that narrative placed upon us from a very young age that, you're gonna graduate from school and get a well-paying job and buy a house and get married and have kids and work and then retire and then you pass away. Something like that. That's supposed to progress through these discrete linear stages. But what this author did is he interviewed hundreds of people to get to know their life stories, and what he found, not surprisingly, is many things happen out of sequence. Like, what if you get some severe health condition, or a loved one passes away, or any of these things that disrupt our life? And if we still are holding on to this model that life is supposed to be linear and progress through these stages, then you're going to feel like you're behind or falling short of where you should be at that point in your life, when in reality it's messy. Like, it's non-linear. And what I appreciate about this book too is he created a whole, what he calls like a deck of disruptors, so like 52 of the most common disruptions that happen in our life, and it can be sorted through, again, I'll visualize another graph. There's one axis is individual and collective, and the other axis is voluntary and involuntary. So there's 4 different quadrants then of these different type of disruptions. So what you just described of the pandemic, for example, is a collective involuntary disruption, because it affected not just you, the whole globe, and it's involuntary. This is not something you initiated. It just happened, right? But interestingly, there are disruptions that sometimes we individually and voluntarily do, like choosing to move away or choosing to leave a job and start a new one or choosing to have a family. And so recognizing that these disruptions or transitions are actually just a normal part of life. And that is also a skill to develop in terms of how to navigate them, because transition or change can feel uncomfortable for people because, you know, what you thought you knew is now not the case anymore. And it takes some time before it resettles itself. But I guess, first of all, the reason I outlined this is to recognize it's normal, that there are going to be changes in your life, and learning how to embrace that rather than try to keep everything, you know, as stable and predictable as possible. It's actually not feasible. Things are going to change whether you like it or not, in some form or another. But again, I think it's so much of it comes back to like self-work and self-reflection. But I think something to ground me or ground people's like, well, what's the next step I want to take? Because of course we can always have like endless to-do lists, and that can feel very daunting. But if you just think about what's the next little step you want to take, then that feels actionable. Because it's going to take, and it did take me time. Like I think for everyone too, like going through the pandemic, there's a grieving period too, whenever there is some type of change, because grief really is you coping with any type of loss, not necessarily like death, but it's like, you know, loss of your lifestyle, loss of your job, or loss of, you know, what you thought things were gonna be. And so it's natural to go through those stages of grief as well as part of your transition process before reestablishing yourself. So again, giving yourself some self-compassion and grace as you go through these. Because one thing that I found insightful about this book as well is every so often we have something called a life quake. So like an earthquake, but in your life. And it's one of those disruptions that's so significant that there's like a you your identity before this event happened and your identity after this event happened, that it's such a stark marker for you. And sometimes people use it in the terms of death and rebirth too, where like a part of me died because of this event, and then I, you know, changed and was reborn into a different type of self afterwards. So recognizing that that will happen, statistically speaking, a few times in your life too, that you'll have these significant life quakes that it might take a lot of time for you to readjust, and figure out how you want to move forward from it. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that's concrete, but but just giving people the awareness that it's normal, that you're gonna like, this is the life you signed up for.
This is what it is. And I have
Yeah,
like so clearly experienced that when I
yeah,
became a mom, because like
hmm,
my journey was that I actually had my son on what was supposed to be my last day of work. And so I didn't have like transition time. I just went from one
hmm,
to the other. And in my experience now, I'm like, I was one person 1 minute and I was a different person another minute, because now I have this
yeah,
identity of mom, and I'm different, and my values are different, and
yeah,
like how I manage my time is different, and like there were so many things that changed in that moment. I love the term life quake because that's
yeah,
totally true. Like big crack, right?
yep,
And I think too this is something that has been interesting for me to navigate as I move from like a corporate career into entrepreneurship as well, is that there's people in my social networks that were there because I was there, right? I always think that
hmm,
school is a great example of that. You're friends with these people because you're in the same place at the same time, taking
yep,
the same class, right?
yep,
But then when you're not, all of a sudden you're like, well, I don't actually have anything in common with those people. And so it's not that I have to like, they're still my high school friends. And I actually like, I still go see my high school friends when I go and visit Edmonton and things like that. But
hmm,
they're my high school friends, and they know a lot less about me than like quite honestly, a lot of my LinkedIn friends, because LinkedIn has become
yep,
like very important part of my social network.
right,
And
hmm,
it's it's a shift, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean that you leave everything behind, right? Like now I'm a mom and I can't be friends with anyone who's not a mom.
Right.
Well, that's not
Yep.
true, because I have lots of friends who are not moms that we
Yep.
have other things in common, or that we like, maybe it's even, I have a friend who I go for sushi with because we like sushi
Yep.
and our husbands don't like sushi, so we go for sushi,
Yep.
right? And it can be just that, and it's actually a really meaningful connection to me, and we do it like once a quarter, and it doesn't have to be a heartbreak, it doesn't have to be grandiose, it doesn't have to be, I guess what all I'm trying to say is it doesn't have to be a specific way. It can just be, if it's something that supports you, great. And if it's something that doesn't support you, maybe there's something to explore there about how you can expand. So I want to, as maybe like a last bit of this conversation for today, because I think maybe we need to have Richard back for another episode. So let's say in general, I hear that there's people who have not very supportive social networks in the workplace, that workplaces aren't necessarily created around a social network, which I think is true in a lot of cases. And so when I think about my experience with my sisters and I extrapolate that to the work environment, do I need to have like full connection in all of my social arenas? Or if I have like really great social connections outside of work, does it necessarily mean that I have to have like super connected work relationships? What are your thoughts on that, Richard?
Yeah. I'm an idealist.
There's no right or wrong. There's no right or wrong answer, obviously.
Oh yeah, for sure. No, I wanted to give a thoughtful response. I'll give my own opinion first, and then I'll turn it back to the audience. But I'm an idealist, so ideally, I would love that every workplace feels, supportive and there's connection and community, because it does actually make a tangible difference. There's research to back it up that like more connected workplaces, well, you'll have more loyal employees and productivity and quality is going to be better. But I know that's not the case. There are a lot of workplaces that, there is a lot of workplace politics and drama and bureaucracy and so on. But ideally, that's what I would like. But to be more specific to your question of, well, okay, if you are feeling connected in other domains of your life, but perhaps not in your work life, is that okay? It's a question to ask yourself. Because again, loneliness is that discrepancy between what you're desiring and what it's actually. So if you feel fine that workplace perhaps is this part where you can compartmentalize in your mind, that's like, I might not get along that well with the people there, or might not have those deep connections, and you're okay with that, then that's okay. Because you can choose and design it for yourself. But I know, at least for me, because I'm so people focused, I crave to be my best self and do my best work. I need to be in an environment where I feel supported and I care about those people around. People care about me and I care about those people around me. But also depends on the profession too, because there might be some technical positions that really it's a lot of independent work anyway, and maybe you would prefer not to work with other people or like in these team or group settings. So again, there's so much of it that you can design for as an individual. But I guess for any people that are listening to this too, or that might be in managerial or leadership positions, to consider that your employees might have different social needs. And have you ever chatted to them about like, how can I best support you, or what are you looking for? There's an author that I'm a big fan of. Her name's Susan Cain, and she has this great TED talk too about the power of introverts. I'm an introvert as well, but I do think there's a lot of workplace environments that are designed perhaps to advantage extroversion of like open office plans and collaboration and all that. But maybe you have the introverts on the team that do need quiet, focused time away from everyone else to do their type of work. And so if you're in a power of influence to like change policy or affect workplace environment, consider that. Like, talk to your people. What kind of social needs do they have, and how might you implement different practices to support everyone and be inclusive of everyone's type of needs. So
Yeah.
there's a few different levels to it. Like as an individual, of course, you can make your own choices, but workplace environment and culture is composed of interactions, your daily interactions. So there's lots of, I guess, levers you can adjust to.
Yeah.
So I get there's so much to it because it circles back to like psychological safety and trust as well, and
Yeah.
people's emotional intelligence, and
Well,
I'll
it's
leave
so
it
funny
there.
because I feel like when we talk about these human components and we talk about
Yeah.
work components, I feel like at the end of the day, it always comes back to like, do we want to call it chicken and egg, right? Like, this isn't a chicken or an egg, it's both parties participate, right? So
Mhm.
it's all well and good if a company is going to ask you, get curious about your social needs, but if you don't do the exploration of yourself to know what your social needs are, they can't help you.
Yeah.
And if like you're doing all of this deep dive and then your company doesn't want to support you, then like obviously you have a misalignment again there. So I feel like this is why I love these conversations, because it's never, I think in society, we love to make it like one person's responsibility, right? Like it's going to be the responsibility of our employee ERG group to like create social
Right.
connection.
Yep.
And you're like, well, I mean, it's a good intention. It's not that the intention is
Yeah.
bad, but what else needs to happen? Like we can't necessarily just have 3 people going out and creating connection, because if I refuse to be connected with from an employee perspective, whether I just choose that because I want to have work be my space where I can just like, I worked with a computer programmer once who was like that. And like, literally all he wanted was for someone to appreciate that he wanted to work in silence and he didn't want to socialize with people at work. And I feel like I was the first person ever who just like gave him that space to be that guy and didn't make our like working relationship dependent on him being different than how he was, right? Like, okay, yeah, we can have, yes, I'm over here and we're pretty much on the exact opposite sides of the spectrum, but I'm also in marketing, right? So like maybe that's expected, but we can still find ways to make communication work, and we can still find ways for us to get what we want out of this so that we both feel like we're winning from the relationship. And I think a lot of times it seems easier to just make it one party's responsibility, but I don't think that's possible. I don't think it's possible to make it one person's responsibility. So this is kind of the fun, is that from an individual perspective, right? What am I doing? Am I craving more social connection? And if so, what am I doing to find that? Am I venturing into places? Am I reaching out to people? Am I even asking myself, what is my level 1 of how I would go up this ladder? And from a people managing spaces, so like business owners or leaders, or even people who manage like social spaces for other people, which I know Richard and I both do, like how are we creating space for social connection? How are we creating space knowing that there are going to be introverts in this crowd, there are going to be extroverts in this crowd, there are going to be ambiverts and omniverts and whatever else people are calling the verts nowadays, but like everyone is different. And how can we create space for that, and very minimally appreciate that everyone is different to the degree where we know like this space that we're creating is for people who are looking for this. And if you're not that, that's fine, right? Like you don't have to be that to be a valuable person or a good person or a worthwhile person. It's just like, this is what we're doing here, and what you're looking for is probably being done elsewhere. So when it comes to, I love to end with a challenge for the peeps who are listening, Richard. So if you could give us one challenge for what people could take away in terms of reestablishing their social network or exploring their social needs, what's one thing you would challenge our audience to do for today?
Yeah. There's so much. Well, I do hope for the people that have been tuning in that, with all the different concepts and content we talked about, that there might be a piece that you resonate with the most. One other term I will introduce briefly is the term social fitness. We talk about physical fitness, but there's an aspect too of, staying fit when it comes to our relationships and our social well-being. And I think the analogy is helpful too, because when you think about physical activity, there's certain types of physical activities that will work better for you and that you prefer. Because you might be, you like going for casual walks or runs. You're not going to be doing like a triathlon or like doing rock climbing or whatever that is. And so it's the same when it comes to the social realm as well, in terms of your social fitness, is considering what are the types of activities that you want to do and that you prefer. Because some people might want to make their connections at the club, at the like being in this crowded, loud place. And for some people, you might prefer those one-on-one interactions. So you might want to join a book or a smaller group interaction. So you might want to join like a book club. And so it's considering, well, there's so many different social activities out there, but it's finding the one that fits for you. So that's what I would encourage people to think about. Like, what type of social fitness do you want to do?
I love this one because I teach cardio dance. So like I love a good workout reference. But also I say this to people all the time about networking, right? If you go to a networking event and you don't like it, that doesn't mean you don't like networking events. That means you don't like that networking event. Exactly. And maybe you don't like the style, or maybe you don't like the energy, or maybe you prefer online, or you prefer in person. It's all of it is good, right? But we have to experience that. And sometimes we have to try. This is a personal experience, but sometimes you have to try training for and doing a triathlon before you decide that triathlons are not your thing. And it's okay, right? We learned lots of things. I was like, okay, what I do like is riding a bike. So then I got a Peloton and now I do that. And so you learn things as you go. But it's sometimes we learn that that's not right for us. And when we're looking at this practice of establishing or reestablishing social networks, we're going to be in places that aren't right. And so I think one of the important takeaways I would have for today then too is that if you've been in a place, or even if you're here today and you're like, oh, this vibe is weird, I don't like hanging out here, like that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. And it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with us either. That just means this is the vibe here and there's a vibe for you elsewhere. So please go and find it. And it might be with lots of people, or it might be with a few people. Again, whatever is right for you. And I know that Richard and I are both wishing all of you much social connection to meet your social needs, whatever that is. So Richard, lastly for today, where can people find you if they're interested more? Because you do some workshops and things in this nature too. Where's the best place for people to connect with you?
Well, I'll start with LinkedIn because I know this is being led you to LinkedIn. So my name is Richard Leitai. I'm on there, but I'm also on other platforms like Instagram and Facebook, also at my name. And then I also have a website, which is www.excusestoconnect.com. Excuses to Connect is the name of my business. So yeah, you can check out more stuff I've done, because I also run a podcast or ran a podcast. I did stop because it was a lot of work, but all the videos are still on there, or all the episodes are still on there, and plus other work I've done. So yes, I would encourage people that this is an excuse to connect. You can reach out to me. It's like, hey, I was listening to this podcast with Tracy and I wanted to reach out to you, and I'd be happy to connect. So yes, that's where people can find me.
Awesome. And one of the things I always recommend too, if you're new to the show or if you haven't heard me say it before, this is an opportunity for you to get connected with each other as well. So in the comments today, we had some marvelous people who are interested in the concept of establishing and or reestablishing social networks. And so if you're looking at growing your social network, connect with each other, connect with me, connect with Richard, get in and stay in the conversation about establishing your social network, because as we talked about, it evolves over time. We need to practice continually doing this, because at some point we're going to have a life quake and then we're going to have to do it again. And this is so great. And Richard does a lot. You do a lot of work with students as well, right? In case there's people here who have maybe some kids who need to get in the conversation.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'll be doing this type of work for the rest of my life, so I'm sure I'm gonna support lots of different populations. But yeah, one particular focus for me right now is with the university and college realm with students, because I know there's many of them feeling lonely and socially anxious, and school is hard as is, but when you don't have a support system, it just makes it that much more difficult as well. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
if that applies to you or you know someone that applies to, I'd be happy to chat as well.
Yeah. Awesome. And just last comment from Chris, because Chris and I had a conversation about random conversations
Yep.
the other
Hmm.
day. And he's saying to always remember the value of random conversations, which I think you guys
Oh
know
yeah.
I'm with him on because I wrote a whole post about it. But this is why I love the format of the show as well. And for those of you who don't know this, when you come on this show as a guest, there's no target destination. This is a conversation because I believe in the value of conversation where going where it needs to go today.
Yep.
And so, if you're interested in being on the show, contact me. I would love to have a random conversation with you about a very
Yep.
interesting topic. And Richard, wish you all the best in like all of your connecting, and giving people excuses to connect. Everyone today, I hope you take this as your excuse to connect with one other person today, and that through that we can create a whole bunch of amazing ripples of connection. Awesome. All right, thank
Great.
you
Thank you
everybody,
again for having me.
and until next time, permission to do you.